Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents The Shipwrecked Mind on Political Reaction by Mark Lilla, narrated by Michael Kramer. Introduction. The Shipwrecked Mind. To the eyes that have dwelt on the past, there is no thorough repair. George Eliot. What is reaction? Consult any decent university library, and you will find hundreds of books in all the world's major languages on the idea of revolution. On the idea of reaction, you will be hard put to find a dozen. We have theories about why revolution happens, what makes it succeed, and why eventually it consumes its young. We have no such theories about reaction, just the self-satisfied conviction that it is rooted in ignorance and intransigence, if not darker motives. This is bewildering. The revolutionary spirit that inspired political movements across the world for 2 centuries may have died out, but the spirit of reaction that rose to meet it has survived and is proving just as potent a historical force from the Middle East to Middle America. This irony should pique our curiosity. Instead, it arouses a kind of smug outrage that then gives way to despair. The reactionary is the last remaining other consigned to the margins of respectable intellectual inquiry. We do not know him. The term reaction has an interesting history. It first entered the vocabulary of European political thought in the 18th century when it was taken over from the scientific treatises of Isaac Newton. In his highly influential work, The Spirit of the Laws, Montesquieu portrayed political life in dynamic terms as an endless series of actions and reactions. He recognized revolution as one such political act, but considered it rare and unforeseeable. One revolution might transform a monarchy into a democracy, another might turn a democracy into an oligarchy. There was no way of predicting the outcome of revolutions, or the kind of reactions they might provoke. The French Revolution changed the meaning of both terms. No sooner had the revolt broken out in Paris than observers began developing stories that would make the revolution the pivot of world history. The Jacobins reset the calendar to year 1 to mark the break, and for good measure renamed all the months so that no citizen would confuse past and present. All previous history took on meaning as a preparation for this event, and all future action could now be oriented toward history's predetermined end, which was human emancipation. What would political life then look like? Hegel thought it would mean the establishment of modern bureaucratic nation-states. Marx imagined a communist non-state populated by free men who would fish in the morning, raise cattle in the afternoon, and criticize after dinner. These differences were less important, though, than their confidence in the inevitability of a rival. The river of time flows in one direction only, they thought. Reversing upstream is impossible. During the Jacobin period, anyone who resisted the river's flow or displayed insufficient enthusiasm about reaching the destination was labeled a reactionary. The term acquired the negative moral connotation it still retains today. Over the course of the 19th century, though, it became apparent that not all critics of the revolution were reactionaries in the precise sense. Reformist liberals like Benjamin Constant, Madame de Staël, and Tocqueville judged the collapse of the Ancien Régime to have been unavoidable, but not the terror that followed, which meant that the promise of the revolution might still be redeemed. Conservatives like Edmund Burke rejected the radicalism of the revolution, but especially the historical myth that subsequently developed around it. Burke considered the idea of history as an impersonal force carrying us to fixed destinations to be both false and dangerous, since it could be used to justify crimes in the name of the future. Liberal and socialist reformers had an additional worry, which was that it would encourage passivity. History, for Burke, develops slowly and unconsciously over time, with results no one can predict. If time is a river, then it is like the Nile Delta, with its hundreds of tributaries branching out in every imaginable direction. The trouble starts when rulers or ruling parties think they can anticipate where history is already headed. This was illustrated by the French Revolution itself, which, instead of ending European despotism, had the immediate unintended consequences of putting a Corsican general on an imperial throne and giving birth to modern nationalism. Outcomes no Jacobin foresaw. Reactionaries are not conservatives. This is the first thing to be understood about them. They are, in their way, just as radical as revolutionaries, and just as firmly in the grip of historical imaginings. Millennial expectations of a redemptive new social order and rejuvenated human beings inspire the revolutionary. Apocalyptic fears of entering a new dark age haunt the reactionary. For early counter-revolutionary thinkers like Joseph de Maistre, 1789 marked the end of a glorious journey, not the beginning of one. With astonishing speed, the solid civilization that was Catholic Europe was reduced to a magnificent shipwreck. This could not have been an accident. To explain it, Maistre and his many progeny became adepts at telling a sort of horror story. It recounted, often melodramatically, how centuries of cultural and intellectual developments culminated in the Enlightenment, which rotted the ancien regime from within, so that it broke to pieces the moment it was challenged. This story then became the template for reactionary historiography in Europe and soon around the world. Post hoc propter hoc is the reactionary's profession of faith. His story begins with a happy, well-ordered state where people who know their place live in harmony and submit to tradition and their God. Then alien ideas promoted by intellectuals, writers, journalists, professors, challenge this harmony, and the will to maintain order weakens at the top. The betrayal of elites is the linchpin of every reactionary story. A false consciousness soon descends on the society as a whole, as it willingly, even joyfully, heads for destruction. Only those who have preserved memories of the old ways see what is happening. Whether the society reverses direction or rushes to its doom depends entirely on their resistance. Today, political Islamists, European nationalists, and the American right tell their ideological children essentially the same tale. The reactionary mind is a shipwrecked mind. Where others see the river of time flowing as it always has, the reactionary sees the debris of paradise drifting past his eyes. He is time's exile. The revolutionary sees the radiant future invisible to others, and it electrifies him. The reactionary, immune to modern lies, sees the past in all its splendor, and he too is electrified. He feels himself in a stronger position than his adversary because he believes he is the guardian of what actually happened, not the prophet of what might be. This explains the strangely exhilarating despair that courses through reactionary literature, the palpable sense of mission. As the reactionary American magazine National Review put it in its very first issue, the mission was to stand athwart history yelling "Stop!" The militancy of his nostalgia is what makes the reactionary a distinctly modern figure, not a traditional one. It also explains the enduring vitality of the reactionary spirit even in the absence of a revolutionary political program. To live a modern life anywhere in the world today, subject to perpetual social and technological change, is to experience the psychological equivalent of permanent revolution. Marx was only too right to remark how all that is solid melts into air, and all that is holy is profaned. He was only mistaken to assume that the abolition of capitalism alone could restore weight and sanctity to the world. The reactionary comes closer to the truth in his historical myth-making when he blames modernity tout court, whose nature is to perpetually modernize itself. Anxiety in the face of this process is now a universal experience, which is why anti-modern reactionary ideas attract adherents around the world who share little except their sense of historical betrayal. Every major social transformation leaves behind a fresh Eden that can serve as the object of somebody's nostalgia. And the reactionaries of our time have discovered that nostalgia can be a powerful political motivator, perhaps even more powerful than hope. Hopes can be disappointed. Nostalgia is irrefutable. The mind of the modern revolutionary has been the subject of great literature, but the reactionary has yet to find his Dostoevsky or Conrad. The great exception is Thomas Mann. His character Leonafta in The Magic Mountain is a brilliant creation. A tubercular Jewish convert to Catholicism who became a Jesuit priest, only to develop sympathies for communism that could just as well have been for fascism. Nafta is driven to a kind of intellectual hysteria by nostalgia for the Middle Ages and the conviction that modern history has gone terribly off course. Only a violent revolution re-establishing absolute authority can redeem mankind, he believes. That Mann modeled this character on the Marxist philosopher and revolutionary Georg Lukács shows how well he understood the affinities between the revolutionary and the reactionary. That Lukács failed to recognize Mann's sketch shows how little he understood himself. The retrograde sexually repressed cleric, the sadistic right-wing thug, the authoritarian father or husband are familiar cartoons in our literature and visual culture. Their ubiquity is a sign of imaginative laziness of the B-movie kind that puts sheriffs in white hats and bandits in black ones. But the engaged political reactionary is driven by passions and assumptions no less comprehensible than those of engaged revolutionaries, and develops theories no less sophisticated to explain the course of history and to illuminate the present. It is nothing but a prejudice to assume that revolutionaries think, while reactionaries only react. One simply cannot understand modern history without understanding how the reactionary's political nostalgia helped to shape it, or make sense of the present without recognizing that, as a self-declared exile, he, no less than the revolutionary, can sometimes see it more clearly than those who feel at home in it. We owe it to ourselves to understand his hopes and fears, his assumptions, his convictions, his blindness, and, yes, his insights. The Shipwrecked Mind makes a very modest start. It is the fruit of my own aleatory reading over the past 2 decades, and offers a series of examples and reflections rather than a systematic treatise on the concept of reaction. For some time I have been trying to better understand the ideological dramas of the 20th century by studying how certain exemplary intellectual figures were swept up into them. In 2001 I published The Reckless Mind, which gathered some portrait essays I had done on thinkers who seduced themselves into supporting or discounting the realities of modern tyrannies, like Nazi Germany, the Soviet Union, China, and the theocratic Republic of Iran. My hope was to shed some light on what I called tyrannophilia, the narcissistic attraction of intellectuals to tyrants who they imagine are translating their own ideas into political reality. While working on that book, I began to notice a different force that shaped the imaginations of political thinkers and ideological movements in the 20th century, and that was political nostalgia. Nostalgia settled like a cloud on European thought after the French Revolution and has never fully lifted. It became particularly potent in the aftermath of World War I, which prompted an end of civilization as we know it despair, hardly different from what opponents of the Revolution felt after 1789. That anguish only intensified after World War II, the revelation of the Shoah, and the deployment of nuclear weapons and their subsequent proliferation. This string of disasters cried out for explanation, and so a crowd of thinkers, philosophers, historians, theologians, began to offer them. First was Oswald Spengler in his hugely influential study, The Decline of the West, 1918 to 1923. A host of competing declinists followed his example, all claiming to have discovered the decisive idea or the decisive event that sealed our doom. Since the 1950s, this has been a popular and growing literature on the European and American right. But its tropes can also be found on the fringe left, where apocalyptic deep ecologists, anti-globalists, and anti-growth activists have joined the ranks of 21st century reactionaries. In a less well-known story, traces of Spengler's historical myth-making also appear in the writings of radical political Islamists, whose story of the secular West's decline into decadence and the inevitable triumph of a vigorous, renewed religion has European fingerprints all over it. The Shipwrecked Mind opens with essays on three early 20th century thinkers whose work is infused with modern nostalgia: Franz Rosenzweig, Erich Voegelin, and Leo Strauss. Rosenzweig was the least explicitly political of the three. A German Jew who began as a scholar of Hegel's political writings, he abandoned philosophy on the eve of World War I to devote the rest of his short life to the revitalization of Jewish thought and practice. His was a complex nostalgia. He was convinced that the failure of Judaism to find a place in modern European society derived in part from an attempt to reform itself according to modern notions of historical progress, which were rooted in Christianity. But he did not believe that a return to simple pre-modern orthodoxy was possible or even desirable. What he proposed was a new thinking that would turn its back on history in order to recapture the vital transcendent essence of Judaism. "The battle against history in the 19th century sense," he wrote, "becomes for us the battle for religion in the 20th century sense." The essays on the philosophers Voegelin and Strauss form a pair. Both left Europe in the 1930s and made very successful careers after the war in the United States, where they acquired ardent followings. They, like many of their contemporaries, thought it urgent to explain the collapse of democracy and the rise of totalitarianism in terms of a calamitous break in the history of ideas, after which intellectual and political decline set in. In his voluminous writings on religion and politics, Voegelin eventually settled on ancient religious Gnosticism as the force that set the West on its disastrous course. Strauss developed a subtle and much deeper account of the history of Western philosophy, built up from careful studies of thinkers from Plato to Nietzsche. In his view, Machiavelli was responsible for the decisive historical break within the philosophical tradition, turning it from pure contemplation and political prudence toward the willful mastery of nature. Though their accounts of Western intellectual history were incompatible, they both helped to shape the historical imagination of American intellectuals on the right. This episode is not without its ironies, for in learning how to tell a story that idealizes a lost America and then blames European ideas for destroying it, they unknowingly reproduce a very European cultural pessimism. A perfect example is The Closing of the American Mind, the popular book by Strauss's student Alan Bloom, where after chapters about the destructive power of European nihilism, one finds the confident declaration that, whether it be Nuremberg or Woodstock, the principle is the same. After these portraits, I consider two contemporary intellectual movements whose rhetoric also traffics in nostalgia, though to very different ends. I begin with theoconservatism, a prominent strain on the American right that brings together traditional Catholics, evangelical Protestants, and neo-Orthodox Jews, who, despite doctrinal differences, share a sweeping condemnation of America's cultural decline and decadence, for which they blame reform movements within these denominations and which they perceive as secular attacks on religion more generally. Their attention tends to focus on the 60s as the significant break in American political and religious history, but more ambitious theocons have looked much further back, even to medieval Catholic theology, to locate where the slippery slope began. I then turn to a small but intriguing movement on the academic far left that focuses on religion from a very different perspective. Its proponents cast a nostalgic gaze on revolutionary movements of the past, and sometimes even on the totalitarian states of the 20th century. What they share is a fascination with political theology, and its most prominent theorist, the former Nazi legal scholar Carl Schmitt. Having given up on the Marxist theory of history and its deterministic materialism, but rejecting the post-1989 neoliberal consensus, they now conceive of revolution as a theological-political event that reveals a new dogma and imposes a new order in defiance of the apparent drift of history. There are deep affinities in their eyes between St. Paul, Lenin, and Chairman Mao. What follows these chapters is an essay about a single event, the deadly terrorist attacks by French-born jihadists that took place in Paris in January 2015. I happened to be living there at the time and was struck by the encounter of two forms of reaction in the incident and its aftermath. On the one side was the nostalgia of the poorly educated killers for an imagined glorious Muslim past that now inspires dreams of a modern caliphate with global ambitions. On the other was the nostalgia of French intellectuals who saw in the crime a confirmation of their own fatalistic views about the decline of France and the incapacity of Europe to assert itself in the face of a civilizational challenge. The entire affair was reminiscent of the period between the two world wars, when an anxious cultural pessimism shared across the political spectrum was fed by the reality of political violence and fantasies about the catastrophic course of history. The Shipwrecked Mind concludes with a meditation on the enduring psychological power of political nostalgia, beginning with the tragicomic quest of Don Quixote to revive the Golden Age. Political nostalgia reflects a kind of magical thinking about history. The sufferer believes that a discrete Golden Age existed, and that he possesses esoteric knowledge of why it ended. But unlike the modern revolutionary, whose actions are inspired by a belief in progress and imminent emancipation, the nostalgic revolutionary is unsure how to conceive of the future and act in the present. Should he simply withdraw and become an inner emigrant, a secret resistor? Should he lead the charge back to the past in all its glory? Or should he strive for a future that will be an even more glorious version of it? Don Quixote grapples with all these possibilities. His personal quest has as much to teach us about the ideas and passions behind the collective political dramas of our time as any learned analysis of social, economic, and cultural forces. We seem to have forgotten that such forces only have force once they are filtered through the subjective outlooks of human beings, the ideas and images they use to make sense of things. The more charmed we have become with our individual psyches, the less adept we have become at understanding the psychology of nations, peoples, religions, and political movements. That the present has become so illegible to us is in no small measure due to this imbalance. The Shipwrecked Mind was conceived as a small contribution to correcting it. Thinkers. The Battle for Religion. Franz Rosenzweig. The Second Temple was not like the first. John Dryden. Franz Rosenzweig was born on Christmas Day, 1886, into an assimilated Jewish family in Kassel, Germany. Although there was a long tradition of religious learning in the family, Franz acquired only a superficial introduction to Jewish life at home, where the Sabbath was not celebrated. His family hoped he would pursue a medical career, but at the University of Freiburg, his interests shifted to philosophy and modern history under the influence of the distinguished scholar Friedrich Meinecke, who supervised his doctoral dissertation. A gifted student, Rosenzweig gave every appearance of being a conventional academic in the years leading up to World War I. Privately, though, he was preoccupied by religious and philosophical questions that scholarship could not help him address. A number of his close Jewish friends and relatives had converted to Christianity, though not for the usual social reasons. In the early years of the 20th century, a Kierkegaardian mood settled on German intellectual life, a sense that political unification, the flowering of a wealthy bourgeois culture, and the triumph of the modern scientific outlook were extinguishing something essential that could only be recaptured through some sort of religious leap. The title of one of the most influential books of the time captured the mood perfectly: The Holy, On the Irrational in the Idea of the Divine and Its Relation to the Rational, 1917, by the Protestant theologian Rudolf Otto. Rosenzweig felt this draw toward the beyond, and was particularly taken with his friend Eugen Rosenstock-Huessy, a Jewish convert to Christianity who would later have a career as a historian in the United States. In discussions and letters, Rosenstock-Huessy tried to convince him that Christianity was, historically speaking, the final and most complete religion. And so, in the summer of 1913, Rosenzweig announced his intention to convert as well, telling his astonished mother that the New Testament was true and that there was only one way, Jesus. What happened next is now part of legend. Before converting to Christianity, the story goes, Rosenzweig decided to attend Yom Kippur services one last time, and there he experienced what might be called a preemptive counter-conversion, deciding on the spot to devote himself to Judaism. That, in any case, was the account Rosenzweig's mother gave. He himself never wrote about the incident, and it is doubtful he would have described such a melodramatic, quasi-Christian awakening. Still, we know from his letters that something important did happen in the fall of 1913, making it possible for him to write one of his converted cousins, "I have reversed my decision. It no longer seems necessary to me, and therefore, being what I am, no longer possible. I will remain a Jew." Rosenzweig was as good as his word. That fall he began to meet with the eminent neo-Kantian philosopher Hermann Cohen, who, after his retirement from the University of Marburg, taught philosophy at a Jewish institute in Berlin, where Rosenzweig was studying Hebrew and Talmud. He also met Martin Buber, who would become a lifelong friend and collaborator, and began writing essays on the nature of Judaism. When the war broke out, Rosenzweig was sent to an anti-aircraft unit on the Macedonian front, which was relatively quiet. That left him time to pursue his studies and even to meet some Sephardic Jews, whose lives of simple piety deeply impressed him. While in Macedonia, Rosenzweig also began work on a book to be called The Star of Redemption, which was an exercise in what he called the New Thinking, and offered a persuasive, if idiosyncratic account of Jewish experience. Notes for the book were copied onto postcards that he mailed back to his mother for safekeeping, and it was from these that he reconstructed and published the book after the war. In 1920, while working on an edited version of The Star, Rosenzweig was called to Frankfurt to become the director of a new Jewish Studies Center, the Freies Jüdisches Lehrhaus, one of the most important sites of the short-lived Jewish reawakening of the Weimar years. He also brought his first life to an end by publishing his dissertation on Hegel's theory of the state, an essential study that is still consulted today. His teacher, Meinecke, was so pleased with it that he offered Rosenzweig a university lectureship, but was turned down. In a vivid letter to the baffled Meinecke, Rosenzweig explained how the spiritual crisis of 1913 had put his life under a dark drive, which I'm aware that I merely name by calling it my Judaism. From that point on, the pursuit of knowledge seemed to him increasingly vain, unless put in the service of flesh-and-blood individuals seeking a way to live. And when The Star of Redemption was published the next year to few and generally uncomprehending reviews, Rosenzweig took it stoically. The center of his life was no longer even Jewish thought. It was the renewal of Jewish life itself. The Frankfurt Study Center was open between 1919 and 1926. Its teachers and students, ranging from future scholars of Judaism to secular thinkers like Erich Fromm and Leo Strauss, were put through a rigorous program meant to lead them from their assimilated lives back to a direct encounter with the sources of the Jewish tradition without the mediation of modern philosophy or Reformed theology. Yet no sooner had this worthy effort begun than Rosenzweig fell ill with a degenerative condition, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, Lou Gehrig's disease, which doctors said would kill him within the year. Defying their predictions, he lived another 7 years.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?